Well, the policy in itself is a crude attempt to limit the influx of foreign people into the country. That in itself is good. But on the other hand, it is an open manifestation of racial discrimination. And that in itself, of course, is inhuman.
G'day, how you going? I'm David A. Elliott. So, what exactly is the White Australia policy? Well, I'll give you a brief history lesson first. Prior to 1901, the 6 states of Australia were separate self-governing colonies of Britain. In 1901, they agreed to form a federation of states with a central government which became the Commonwealth of Australia. Fiji and New Zealand were part of the discussions but did not end up joining in the end. Australia did and still does have the British monarch as its head of state, so all legislation requires royal assent from the Queen before it is formally part of Australian law. Now, if we go back to 50 years earlier, New South Wales had a population of about 200,000 people. Then, with the gold rush, people came from all over the world, including about 50,000 Chinese. In Queensland, many Pacific Islanders were brought in as cheap labour. This is often considered a de facto form of slave labour. But anyway, racial tensions occurred and there was significant opposition to Chinese and Pacific Islander immigration. As a consequence, one of the first acts of federation was to restrict immigration of non-white, non-European immigrants and to favour European immigrants with an emphasis on the British. Early drafts of the Immigration Restriction Act 1901 banned non-European immigration, which was based on South African legislation. The Prime Minister, Edmund Barton, stated, "The equality of man was never intended to apply to the equality of the Englishman and the Chinaman." However, the British government were concerned at causing offence to their Japanese allies and British subjects in India. So the legislation was changed to a 50-word dictation test in any European language. There were objections in Parliament, mainly by those who wanted specific races banned and listed in the legislation. However, the legislation was passed without reference to race, though it is actually considered the beginning of the White Australia policy. The White Australia policy was not a formal policy as such, but a series of acts of Parliament that effectively led to a preference for European and especially British immigrants. The main tool was the Dictation Test, which initially could be given any time in the first year of immigration. Later, it was changed to 5 years and could be administered any number of times. So, if they passed the test the first time, then other languages could be chosen until they failed the test. They would then be declared illegal immigrants and deported. At the beginning of the Second World War, Prime Minister John Curtin stated, "This country shall remain forever the home of the descendants of those people who came here in peace in order to establish in the South Seas an outpost of the British race." During the war, another politician stated, "The policy of White Australia is now, perhaps, the most outstanding political characteristic of this country. However, after the Second World War, it was considered Australia needed to populate or perish, a slogan coined in 1945 by Arthur Caldwell, Minister for Immigration. The initial target was for large-scale migration from Britain and northwestern Europe. However, from 1945, it led to progressive changes to legislation that weakened the White Australia policy until it was considered to end in 1973 with amendments to the Immigration Act that prevented discrimination on race. The Racial Discrimination Act of 1975 effectively made it illegal to use racial criteria for any government purpose. Finally, have a look at this 1962 news item interviewing people on the street for their views on the White Australia policy. Quite an eye-opener for modern Australians. Have a good one and see you around like a ristle.